Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you hear on the Village of Nothing Much, with audio engineering and sound design by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and various goodies to help you romanticize your life. Which is really what this show is all about. It's about lifting up small, sweet moments of everyday life and finding the sparkle in them, enjoying them more, and all of that becoming so habitual that you don't even have to try. And I think one of the ways we get there is through stories. So I've written this big collection of stories, hundreds by now, that all take place in what I call the Village of Nothing Much. They came out first on my bedtime story podcast, Nothing Much Happens, and now we're giving you this less sleepy version here. I think they pair so well with chores and walks and gazing out of windows while you're under your favorite blanket. So please get comfortable, and let's take a deep breath in through the nose, and let it out. Nice. Do that one more time. Breathe in, and sigh. Good. Our stories today start out in the snow, as toboggans whiz past and saucers slip over the slopes. We'll make snow angels and tromp around in our boots in the Sledding hill. Then in the greenhouse, we'll put on our gardening gloves and clip roses for a big order at the inn. Finally, we'll welcome dear friends at the door and light the candles on the table for Sunday dinner. The Sledding Hill. By now, the paths were well worn. From the edge of the frozen pond, you went up the hill, where you could look out and plan your route down from the open crown of high, flattened snow. And once you'd bumped and skimmed down the slope, momentum slowly draining away, you'd tumble, laughing and shouting into the tall drifts of powder that acted like bumpers in a bowling lane. We'd already been a handful of times this winter, but today was too good a day to miss the hill. You might think you want a bright, sunny day for sledding, but with all that snow laid out around you, the light would be too bright, nearly blinding, so a little cloud cover is actually better. And today we still had the clouds that had given us 3 or 4 inches of fluffy, fresh snow overnight. At the hill, sledders were riding down the slope, letting out shouts of excitement and thrill, and then trudging back up to the top to do it all over again. We'd brought a couple of saucers and an old wooden toboggan that had seen many winters of use. In fact, it had hung in my family's garage when I was a child, and I'd first been taught to hold the reins and tuck my feet in behind the sloping curl of wood at its bow by my dad. He'd sit behind me and tuck his arms tightly around me so that as we bombed down the slope, I felt simultaneously like I was flying and also completely safe. Our hill had a bin near the path to the top, a sort of sled library, so that you could borrow a saucer or other snow-skimming conveyance for a day of use if needed. We'd put in a racer that had proved a little too fast for us. It was red and had a rope to tow it by, and racing stripes on its body, and I didn't see it in the bin as we started the hike up the hill. I liked that. Someone was playing with it right now. At the top of the hill, we got ready to plop down into our saucers. It was always a bit awkward to fold your legs when you had thick layers of long johns and snow pants on and big chunky boots, but if it hadn't bothered us when we were kids, we didn't see why it should bother us now. One side of the slope was sort of a bunny hill option, with a gradual, gentle descent. Then there was a middle path, a bit steeper, a little faster, and then the longest and fastest run. which was almost entirely used by those under 15 who seemed to be made of rubber. If they bounced out of their sleds, they just sprang right back up and ran to the path for another trip down. In fact, there was an intentional bump in the middle of that speedy side of the hill. It was groomed by sledders all winter and had been since I was a kid riding it. It would send the sledder into the air for a few seconds, and I remembered that feeling of weightlessness, a sudden drop in my stomach, and then bouncing back into the snow and coasting for an age while the momentum ran down. Now it was thrill enough for me to watch. I didn't need to fly over that bump myself anymore. In fact, I stood for a while at the top and watched a few sledders flopping down onto their saucers and racers and zooming down the hill. They laughed as they went. I laughed as I watched. I spotted the red sled we'd left in the library as it was pulled up the hill by a girl in a blue coat and earmuffs. At the top, she sat down on it and rocked it forward inch by inch until the tilt overtook her and she went sailing down through the snow. She screamed with laughter, and I was delighted as she banked into the drifts, tumbled out, and reached for the rope to climb the hill again. I finally set myself up at the edge of the bunny slope and got settled in my saucer. I scooted just as she had to the edge, but couldn't quite get myself into motion on this gentler hill. "Want to push?" I heard from behind me. "You'd better," I called back with a laugh. I felt mittened hands on my back, and a gentle shove sent me down the hill. It was still a thrill, even when it was slower and softer. I still felt like a kid on an adventure. At the bottom, I spun around in my saucer as I ran out of steam and watched others come down around me. An hour passed in a matter of moments. We used the saucers for the first 5 runs or so, and even had a go at the medium-fast slope, which we said proved we weren't scaredy cats, and then went right back to the bunny hill. Then we climbed onto the toboggan, which, in all honesty, we did not quite fit. It was the perfect size for a grown-up and a little, but 2 grown-ups was a stretch. And stretch we did to get our arms around each other as we took turns in front and back. Knees tucked up as straight legs were too long and holding onto the rope as if we could really steer. Still, we laughed till our sides hurt, all the way down. And after one spill into the snow, just laid, sprawled out and chuckling for a while. Fresh snow was falling, and I flipped over onto my back and started tracing a snow angel with my arms and legs. I felt sort of cradled in the drifts of snow. I thought about how many winters I'd taken the toboggan up to the top of this hill, how many times I'd dropped into the powder and made this shape. It reminded me to catch a few of the flakes on my tongue to complete the ritual. When the cold eventually drove me up onto my feet, we stood for a few moments to watch the snow fall over all of us. It was like a scene in a snow globe. The hill, the sledders, the frozen pond beyond. I felt like I had turned a key on a music box and was watching some perfect action take place. The snow was coming down faster, heavy flakes that were big enough to show their incredible structures when caught on the palm for a moment or two before they melted away. We decided it was time to go home, peel off our frozen layers, and thaw our toes in front of the fire. I pulled the toboggan behind me as we headed toward the car, and I paused at the bin of sleds for borrowing, and we both looked at it, then back at the toboggan and around at the kids and grown-ups sledding together. Kind of seems like I started, and we caught eyes. Yeah, I agree. So I propped it up in the bin and gave a thank you pat to the well-loved wood runner, and we went home. The greenhouse. When I was younger, there was a shop I would visit all year round, though it was most magical in the winter. It sold flowers and houseplants, candles and journals and blocks of French soap tied with ribbons. It was built inside of an old farmhouse, and in each room a fountain burbled, and the air smelled of wood smoke and lavender. Outside of the back door was a pond that was filled with tadpoles each spring, and a stony path leading to their greenhouse. The greenhouse felt like a miracle on cold winter days. You would trek through the snow to the door, and as soon as you pushed it open, a wave of warm tropical air would wrap around you. Inside, plants grew everywhere, from the cracks in the field stones, up the legs of old cast-iron chairs, out of broken terracotta pots on shelves that seemed impossible to reach with a watering can. It felt like they hardly even had to try to grow things there. In fact, it seemed that they might be working harder to keep the space from being taken over by the creeping vines and shoots. They had a dog that often greeted you when you climbed out of your car and walked companionably beside you as you browsed, eventually finding a sunny patch to lie in. I think he was a setter with coppery red fur and gentle eyes. And though I often left there without buying anything, I felt I was always coming away with more than I'd had when I'd entered. Eventually, the owner had retired and reclaimed the house for herself. And I wondered if the plants still grew there like they had before. It's funny how you don't always see the paths that brought you to where you end up. The connections, they're not always clear while you're hip deep in them. But now I realize that place planted a seed in me, pun intended. I'd been young then, just starting out in life. I'd been in my first apartment, trying to figure out what I wanted my life to look like. And each time I would step into that greenhouse, though I wasn't conscious of it at the time, I realize now I'd felt like I was coming home. I am smiling at that feeling now in my own greenhouse. It's not nearly as big as the one behind that lovely shop, but it is warm and tropical and smells of soil and chlorophyll and jasmine. And I feel so lucky to be the caretaker of all its plants and flowers. Mine is more of a workshop than a place open to the public, but I think I was influenced by the charm and whimsy of that special place because I find that we, me and the flora, are happiest when it is neat and pretty. I have a pegboard strung with a couple dozen colors of ribbon for my bouquets, and pretty baskets for my tools and gloves. I play music for us. Again, that's me and the plants. And on sunny days, we listen to happy songs, the kind you sing along to in the shower. When it rains and storms, we listen to powerful classical music full of strings and drama. My own dog, a basset hound whose howl sounded so much like arugula that I named him that, scuttled along the stone floor and snored while I worked. I have a long work table I rescued from an estate sale in a barn a few years ago. Its scrubbed top has seen many repottings and propagations, and today it was lined with vases that I was preparing for Valentine's Day at the inn. For music, I'd turned on a station of crooners and sirens, which seemed to fit the theme, and pulled on a fresh pair of red garden gloves, and began to look through the roses I'd cut. Each room in the inn would have a small vase of them for the bedside table, and then I was making a large arrangement for the entryway beside the grand staircase. I was proud of my roses. When I walked through their section in the greenhouse and saw how tall they stood on their long stems, the variety of colors and the sweet scent that came from them, I felt like I really had achieved something. Some roses look beautiful, but offer nothing to appreciate when it comes to perfume. Others have scent, but only a thin ring of fragile petals. These roses would last a while, were truly beautiful to look at, and the inn would smell like romance in every room. I had plenty of deep red roses, They're classic, and they're always requested. But I also grew pale pink, tangerine orange, a deep purple that was almost black, an elegant antique white, and a sweet periwinkle blue rose. I decided to cut some of each and tuck one into each of the bedroom's bouquets. I wondered what the guests would think about the extra bloom of color. I hoped, if luck was on my side, that for at least a few of the guests, I'd be adding a favorite or something that might spark a happy memory. I built each bouquet with the non-red rose at its center, adding in some greenery and ribbons. I had a selection of green plants cut to fold in, and some that may surprise you. I like to use sweet Annie and silver cardoon leaves, but I also used curly parsley, which held up well and stayed a pretty bright green against the red. I had stems of mint, nothing refreshes love like mint, and soft needle pine branches. All these scents together sang of winter and romance. For the large table arrangement, I had a beautiful old silver ice bucket, one that had, I imagined, held many celebratory bottles of champagne in its day. I had started to polish it up and make it like new, but then I decided I wanted it to show its years in use. It felt fitting for the old inn, and I started to layer flowers and herbs and greens into it until it was nearly bursting. I wanted each guest to stop when they came into that grand old entryway and literally smell the roses. It called out to your senses to be enjoyed. When I was done, I stooped down to pet Arugula, who was on his bed beneath the work table. I wouldn't mind some company as I loaded up the vases into my truck and delivered them to the inn. Arugula was half asleep, but I leaned in close to his giant, floppy ear and whispered, "Want to go for a ride in the car?" His eyes popped open and he stared at me, his tail beginning to bang out a rhythm behind him. "I heard the innkeeper has a new kitty. Maybe we can meet him." He was up on his short legs in an instant. I'd wondered all those years ago what my life should look like. I smiled as I picked up a box packed with vases, thinking that if this was it, I'd done well. Sunday dinner. On a hook inside the pantry, I have a small collection of aprons. One is specifically for wearing while making bread. It is perpetually dusted with flour, and even when it's fresh from the wash, shows the singe marks from when I got too close to the Dutch oven. Then I have a sort of everyday apron with cherry blossoms on a blue background that I wear on any old night when I'm throwing together a stir-fry or a pan of butter beans. It's got a growing hole next to one of the ties, and I know that one of these days when I pull it around me, it will come apart. But for now, it works just fine. And then there's a frilly little half apron, the sort that just covers from the waist down. I bought it at a craft fair, and it inspired a daydream of wearing it to serve cocktails and vol au vents at a swanky party in my living room, which has not yet occurred. But hey, it could happen. And then I have my Sunday apron. A bit fancier, a proper, sturdy, full-length chef's apron with a pocket on the bib and nice long ties. I reached for it today and tied it around me as I looked up at my shelf of cookbooks. I was making Sunday dinner today, and our neighbors from down the street were coming to enjoy it with us. There are plenty of Sundays, plenty of other days as well, when I don't feel like cooking, like pulling out all the stops and setting the table with nice dishes, and that's okay. Sometimes a meal of popcorn and ginger ale in front of the TV nourishes us more than 3 courses from scratch can. It really depends on what we need most that day. But today, I was in the mood to cook, to feed friends and loved ones, to dirty plenty of dishes and let the candles on the dining room table burn down till they guttered and went out. And the first step was my apron. Once it was tied snugly, and I had a fresh tea towel threaded through the tie, I circled around the kitchen and began to pull ingredients and tools from shelves and drawers. It wasn't really spring yet, and though the sun was out, drying up mud puddles today, by the time our guests arrived, it would be setting, and I wanted to feed them something hearty and comforting, something that would keep them warm as they walked back home in the chilly night air, and see them through a good night's sleep. I finally settled on a good stew with lots of carrots and potatoes and beans, and with soft, biscuity dumplings cooked on top. In the fridge, I picked through the crisper drawer for ingredients, all the vegetables I would need, as well as a bunch of fresh dill that would make the gravy flavorful and herby. I brought out my big soup pot, set up a cutting board and chef's knife. It took a few minutes, but I got into a rhythm, peeling, chopping, adding to the pot, stirring and seasoning. The whole house began to smell so good, and the windows even steamed up in the kitchen as the stove and oven filled with side dishes. I cracked the window over the sink and leaned into the stream of cool air for a moment. From outside, I could smell damp winter, melting snow, and saturated earth. I sifted flour and baking powder together into a big mixing bowl. I'd wait to add the dumplings till just before I was ready to serve. They would only need 15 minutes or so to cook. I stripped the leaves from a stalk of rosemary and chopped them finely. Into the flour they went. In the oven, I had chickpeas and cabbage wedges roasting. I made a salad with soft butter lettuce and tiny sweet tomatoes. I mixed a vinaigrette with mustard and olive oil and red wine vinegar in a jar and set it aside. In the cupboard beside the pantry, a leftover convenience from decades before, was an ironing board. I love to cook. I do not love to iron, but I do like the tablecloth and serviettes to be freshly pressed for Sunday dinner. So I smiled gratefully through the steam on the stove as I heard the ironing cupboard open and the iron begin to hiss. I peeked over and watched as the lines were smoothed out of the linens. There are different ways to make guests feel welcome. Sometimes the fine china and the cloth napkins do that. They show the trouble you are happy to go to for their comfort. Though I have also felt very welcome when told to get a plate from the cupboard and fill it at the stove, to take a fork from the jelly jar on the table. Those meals feel intimate because of their informality, because you are so firmly a member of the family that you are let into imperfect daily life. Our friends who were coming tonight were those kinds of friends. We'd been there at their twins' birthday parties, summer cookouts with paper plates in the backyard, holidays and Saturday mornings with coffee on the porch. Still, tonight I wanted to roll out the red carpet for them, or the white tablecloth, as it were. It was laid over the dining room table now, and I took a break from the kitchen to lay out the plates and bowls and glasses. I set out the china dishes for all of us, and thought of the kiddie plates we used to set for the twins when they were little. They were teenagers now. Their little plates had had the dividers so the food wouldn't touch, baby bunnies and porcupines and fawns printed on them, and I still had them in the cupboard. Silly, I know, but I wasn't ready to let go of them yet. I took fresh taper candles from the sideboard and struck a match to melt a few drops from the bottom of each one into their holders to help them stick, then trimmed the wicks and set them lit on the table. "Shall I turn on some music?" "Oh, yes, please," I called back as I returned to the stove. Everything was done once I dropped the dumplings in. The cabbage had caramelized into a beautiful golden brown in the oven, and I laid the wedges out on a serving plate, topped them with walnuts and a miso tahini butter. I looked up, and through the window, I could see them walking over. The sun had just set, and the sky was pale purple, streaked with pink. The twins were rushing ahead, their parents strolling behind them, holding hands, one with a dish tucked under an arm, one pointing something out in a tree. I smiled with the jar of vinaigrette still in my hand and went to the door to let them in. The twins' faces were cold as they wrapped me in a hug. "No coats?" I asked.
"It's not far,"
said one.
"I'm starving,"
said the other. Behind them came their parents, saying how delicious it smelled, showing me the glazed lemon loaf in the dish, sighing as they let me take their coats, and saying how good it was to be together for Sunday dinner. Whew, that last story got me a little teary-eyed. We started today with the sledding hill, and I have to confess right up front that sledding no longer appeals to me. It falls right in line with tubing behind a ski boat. It just looks painful to me now, but I do enjoy watching kids and other folks take those runs on their saucers. I grew up in Flint, Michigan, and as a kid went sledding at Mott Park, which definitely did have one of those intentional bumps that would send you flying. I was back there a few years ago and couldn't believe how small the park was. I thought it was acres, with all these trails that went up behind groves of trees and with huge open meadows. But it is not even a city block. I think it's quite a tender thing to do, to go back to sacred spots from childhood. And if that is something you could do, here's a little push to give it a try. This story also made me think about how important joy is. And especially right now. Joy is a way to resist, and you deserve it. So I hope you find a way to spark some joy this week. In the greenhouse, we meet a new dog. I had a beagle named Lois. I adopted her when she was a year old, and she lived to be 16, and she absolutely had an arugula howl. So I thought of her when I wrote about this little basset. Could there be a better life than arranging flowers in your own greenhouse with your favorite music playing and your little dog snoring at your feet? Goals. This episode also overlaps a bit with stories about Valentine's Day at the Inn, which shows up in the story Sycamore Settles In. That's episode 56 of this show. And starting next week on Nothing Much Happens, a 3-week series called Valentine's at the Inn, in which, by the way, we finally find out what is behind the secret stair we found at Halloween. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's cool. We're almost 7 years in on these stories, so there is just a lot to listen to, but we will catch you up eventually. Finally, we tied on our apron and got to cooking in Sunday dinner. I am an apron wearer and always start with that when I'm cooking. I wonder if that is common. Do y'all wear an apron? When I was reading about the stew coming together, it reminded me of this time I was first dating my wife, and she had made us, on a wintry Saturday afternoon, a big pot of cassoulet, which is like a French white bean stew. And it was like a drug. We both got so sleepy immediately that we just left our bowls on the table and needed to nap, and we had to sit down halfway up the stairs and just lean against the banister for a moment. I hadn't reread this one since I'd written it, and it strikes me that I write a lot about friends so close that they become your family. I don't imagine that's something new in the world, but there is something so vital about it in our world right now. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes making friends as an adult can be a little tricky. So if you don't have this in your life right now, it doesn't mean that there is anything wrong with you. And it might look a lot different as you start to find those kind of friendships and invest time in them. Maybe they live 1,000 miles away and you can't cook them dinner. But there are lots of ways to grow close to people. Just speaking from my own experience, what has been most important in developing close friendships as a grown-up has just been reaching out, sending messages regularly, showing up in the ways that we can, asking to do things together, even if they're online, just making it clear that you value them and that you care how they are. Thanks for spending this time with me in the village of nothing much. We'll be back next week with more stories. Till then, I wish you sparks of joy, roses and wet noses, and moments with the ones you love.